Barrett. The, Francis is the program director of Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health, and I'm delighted to have Francis here to be part of the proceedings and to lead this wonderful presentation of the senior doctoral fellows who are linked up to Buddhism, psychology, and mental health.
Great. Thank you, Tara. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm so excited to hear these presentations. And so my role is simply to introduce each of you and then keep time. And so we have 20-minute talks from each of you, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion after each one, I guess, a few questions or discussion after each talk. Daniel, are you okay to go first?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I was having a difficult time trying to find the passcode on the way here. That's what caused my delay.
Yeah, so it's tricky to keep track of these things.
It's very challenging.
Great. So I'll just read a quick introduction of you for the record, although I think we know who you are. But Daniel is an award-winning classical guitarist, an educator, performance coach, and researcher. He's the guitar instructor at Wilfrid Laurier's University Faculty of Music. And he's also completing a Doctor of Musical Arts in Guitar Performance at the University of Toronto, where his research, which we'll hear about today, examines strategies from cognitive-behavioral psychology and guitar pedagogy for managing music performance anxiety in guitarists. So Daniel's research builds on his extensive performance background as well. And I actually kind of really wish that we were going to hear some of your music, Daniel. Yeah. I see that piano back there is tempting me to say that. But so Daniel's given concerts around the world, Canada, United States, Austria, Italy, Japan. He's won several awards, and his debut album called Inspirations was just released in 2021, which has a bunch of new works and some premiere recordings of classical guitar works by Canadian composers. Daniel has a bachelor's and master's degree from University of Ottawa, and he's now been our BPMH doctoral fellow. So Daniel, please tell us about your research. I'm so excited to hear more.
Hello, thank you for having me, first of all. It's of course been an honor to be here and surrounding the college, hovering around. Not as much in person as I would like, but it was wonderful to be part of this and to take part in the activities and to be invited as a scholar here. Today I'll be talking about my research on music performance anxiety, as you mentioned, and so I've brought a little presentation here. So basically what I'll be talking about today is a kind of summary of my dissertation research, because that's where I am in the stage of this program, and so I hope I can share this with you. And it's really interesting because as a member of the Faculty of Music, I've spent a lot of time with the Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health program, just taking courses there to supplement my research and working with a lot of the people who work there as well. So it's very exciting to be part of this. And would I be able to share my screen, please? Excellent, thanks. Whoops. Would I be able to have hosting?
Yes, I'm going to see if I can do it. We may need to bring, oh good, Francis, you did it, right?
I think, there we go. There we
perfect.
go. That's
you should be okay now.
So I'll just open this up. There we go. Great. So, music performance anxiety and the classical guitar, expert approaches in performance and cognitive behavioral psychology. Again, I'm excited to be here and talk to you about what this means, what all of this is. So this is a multifaceted, interdisciplinary project, and yeah. So I guess I use this, I wanted to see how I could simplify it with as few elements as possible. And so this is basically a summary of everything I'm doing here. We can talk about what music performance anxiety is and the severity. It severely affects nearly all musicians at some points in their lives and may cause musicians to abandon their careers or develop maladaptive coping mechanisms in attempts to manage their symptoms. These range in a wide variety of, there's a wide spectrum of possibilities, and these to even suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation and kind of things as well. So it's important to acknowledge the importance of music performance anxiety and how serious it can be. What my research is basically focusing on is taking the most effective treatments from cognitive behavioral psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapies, and therapies from behavioral psychology in general. These include sports psychology and other similar things like this, and novel research that we have today. And we're comparing these to strategies from expert classical guitar teachers. And the reason for this is because expert classical guitar teachers develop a heuristic knowledge of what they do through years and years of study. Everyone who becomes an expert classical guitar teacher is somebody who has been playing music for at least a decade, most likely 2 decades. And they've been working with musicians and helping them grow and learning to deal with music performance anxiety in their own way through their own experience. This is not something that someone can choose not to deal with in their musical life, whether they have an effective treatment from psychology, whether they work with a therapist, or whether they find their own methods. They're going to always find methods. So they are, in their own ways, experts in this topic, although they are sometimes shooting in the dark and don't always know exactly what to do. So this research is trying to bridge that gap a bit. So I'll talk a little bit more about my research questions here, and they're really exploring the strategies that these two disciplines have for managing music performance anxiety. And the 2 questions are, what approaches do expert guitar instructors recommend for managing MPA in the existing literature? And how do expert guitarists and from cognitive behavioral therapies? So we're trying to see how these 2 things come together, and we're comparing and contrasting them. As a teacher at Laurier University, I fit this paper's definition of an expert guitar instructor, and so my narratological experience, knowledge, and a researcher and a teacher also come together in one chapter of this dissertation, where I actually discuss my own experience with music performance anxiety and methods that I've used to deal with it, using researched methods and using other methods as well. So these include martial arts, mindfulness-based practices, and other things as well. So of course we need to know what music performance anxiety is. We've been mentioning it a lot, but we can see it as the distressing and or actual impairment of performance skills in a public context to a degree unwarranted given the individual's musical aptitude, training, and level of preparation. So this goes to say that the element is still core to performance. And when someone prepares and they practice the piece many, many times, and they feel comfortable in the practice room, but they get on stage and they still have a performance breakdown, or they still play far below the level that they did at home, we can call this music performance anxiety. So there is a gap there between the preparation that is done at home and what ends up coming out on stage. In sports psychology, performance anxiety can be described as choking under pressure in general. Terminology in general, you'll find psychological flexibility is described as mental toughness in sports psychology. And in acting and performing arts, it's common to refer to MPA as stage fright. This is particularly common in theater. So this is not just a problem in the music world. This is a problem in ballet, all performing arts that exist. And we can also think of MPA as a negative interpretation of arousal symptoms, or the opposite of flow. We can see flow as antithetical to the idea of music performance anxiety. I really like the idea of thinking it as of it as a negative interpretation of arousal symptoms, because arousal symptoms occur whenever we do activities that we find exciting, that we find to us, as well as experiences that are aversive or terrifying. So arousal symptoms can be included as increases in heart rate, sweating, blushing, cold hands for some people, feeling a fight or flight autonomic stimulation. These are all arousal symptoms that can appear, and they don't necessarily have their own meaning. They are just an experience. And so when we interpret that experience as being negative, and I say, I want this feeling to stop, I need to make it stop, I want this to end, and we get that dysphoria that accompanies that, we can call this music performance anxiety, because this is a negative interpretation of subjective symptoms. Another person may experience the same physiological symptoms as someone with music performance anxiety and may say, I'm excited, I'm pumped up to play, to get out there and play for everyone. And this is a completely different thing. But they're the same symptoms. There are three categories of symptoms that we usually associate with MPA, and they're the physiological. Those are the ones that we know most commonly. These are tachycardia, hands sweating, shaking, trembling, quivering, alexia, being unable to read the music, suddenly losing the ability to read music, as is more of a cognitive symptom. Dizziness, nausea, and vomiting also happen. Vladimir Horowitz was a famous pianist who used to vomit before he went on stage. He would usually have projectile vomit before he went on stage, which is something he wrote about quite a bit, and it's very interesting to read because he's contributed so much to music. There's also a general hyperarousal and hyper-awareness that happens on stage. So they tend to notice things that they would not normally notice. Someone is phobic and they see an insect, for example, if they're afraid of insects. They arousal. This is why music performance anxiety is also considered social phobia, social anxiety disorder, in the DSM-5. There are cognitive symptoms as well that appear, which include catastrophizing and worrying about the future. And I like to think of these as what ifs we tell ourselves. What if I go on stage and it all collapses? What if I go on stage and I totally mess up in front of everyone? What if I go on stage and something horrible happens? There's no limit to the imagination. There are also behavioral symptoms. So these are changes in our baseline behaviors that happen in the months and the weeks preceding a performance. So these include over-practicing, under-practicing, oversleeping, undersleeping, overeating, undereating. There's really no limit to the range, but the important thing is that these are symptoms that appear outside of the common behaviors that the person exhibits in their regular life. In general, we categorize these as experiential avoidance behaviors. So these are experiences that take you away from the distress of the feeling, and instead of using a proactive, adaptive situation to help you manage the stress, instead we fall into things that take us away and help us forget. Helps us in the short term, in the long term, it backfires. Okay, there are also predicting factors for music performance anxiety that are very important, and I guess the most important one is perfectionism. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. Yeah, and the most important one is perfectionism. So there's a kind of double-edged sword of perfectionism in musicians, and one of the ideas is that performers tend to be very high achievers, and they tend to have a very high expectation of themselves. They tend to be perfectionistic in order to be successful. So we see this pattern in business, we see this pattern in academics, we see this pattern in musicians, and we see this pattern in athletes. And I think it's very helpful to reconcile this seeming contradiction by distinguishing between maladaptive and adaptive perfectionism. So maladaptive perfectionism is essentially focused on eliminating errors, achieving flawlessness, and adaptive perfectionism is interested in becoming the best you can be, trying to improve in all facets of your life, trying to be the best you can be as a musician, making the music. No, it's not enough to just take the mistakes out. It's you have to. What are you giving? What are you? Pivotal role in music performance anxiety, and they can predict future performance breakdowns. So if you have a lot of performance breakdowns, you're more likely to have them again. And we can see performance breakdowns very similarly to the way we see trauma, because it is a type of traumatic event for individuals. There is a humiliation factor. There is a feeling of really a loneliness, isolation, and all the things we associate with trauma. So this is something that teachers are not always prepared to deal with. And of course, the centrality of the event is important too. So if you're doing an audition or you're doing a major event, major performance, you're going to perform differently than if you were in a situation where you were just playing for your friends or playing in your room. I'm sorry, these windows I'm having to move them in order to see my own writing. Cognitive-behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as mindfulness-based interventions, have demonstrated efficacy in treating social anxiety disorder, as well as MPA directly. But we really do need more research to determine the best therapies to assist with music performance anxiety. Currently, cognitive behavioral therapy is the gold. I do believe that upcoming years, the acceptance and commitment therapy will far exceed that as the gold standard for treatment. Expert guitarists have also written extensively about MPA, including all of these names who you probably don't recognize very much, but they are all great classical guitarists who teach in universities all over the world. Some of them are alive and some of them have passed, but they have all written extensively on this issue. It's interesting to note that I could not find any sources in the 19th century or before that had anything. Oops, the light turned off in my office. I couldn't find any sources that were from the 19th century discussing music performance anxiety, which suggests it may have been more of a taboo topic back then. There are some patterns that emerged as well that we'll talk about in a second. These guitarists recommended strategies from their own heuristic perspective, and they were mainly in the form of. I also added my own narratological experience, and that forms a core part of the dissertation. So just so I'm using all this nomenclature and jargon, and so it's important that I clarify what I mean. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a therapy that builds from behavioral psychology, and it includes the concept of cognitions. So behavioral therapy was primarily mostly focused on outer behaviors that were visible in the outside world. But over time, we realized that inner behaviors affect outer behaviors as well. So thoughts that we have can affect our outer behaviors. This seems like a given for most people, but this was a heavily disputed thing until the second wave emerged. So CBT uses strategies to disrupt and behaviors by recognizing them, becoming mindful of them, and replacing problematic behaviors and thoughts with helpful ones. These strategies include exposure therapy, desensitization training, behavioral activation, psychoeducation, and more. CBT recognizes that we have a lot of cognitive distortions, which are inherently illogical thoughts that usually lead us into maladaptive behaviors and distressful situations. ACT is subtly different than cognitive behavioral therapy and can be considered as a type of third wave, which incorporates mindfulness as a core construct. Because mindfulness has so many benefits and there are so many unique aspects to it, it does really change the game. And there's a fundamental difference between ACT and CBT that you'll see. And the main one is that earlier I said that we're trying this is not, we don't really know that this is possible in the long term. On the short term, it's certainly possible, but we don't know if the long changing effects will last. So what acceptance and commitment therapy attempts to do is acknowledge, first of all, that we can't delete our inner behaviors. We're not a computer processor that can just simply delete the files. We can create infinite new relational frames by developing our psychological flexibility. And ACT is focused on developing psychological flexibility. All of the 6 processes of ACT in conjunction to create psychological flexibility, which is generally a process of moving towards the things that matter in life. So rather than simply trying to change an experience that is happening or trying to control a situation that is happening, especially when we have very little control over it, such as our physiological experience of music performance anxiety, notice the feeling and decide, I'm willing to experience this feeling in order to become a better musician. I'm willing to experience this feeling in order to share music with the audience, in order to live out my values. So exposure is as it is with CBT, but we do exposure in order to service our values. And this is a core difference. Of course, our most experiences tend to involve our values. This has to do with the amount of investment emotionally we put into our values. So the things that we care about, we spend more energy and have a lot to lose when we invest so much. With music, musicians sacrifice their lives. They sacrifice money. They sacrifice so many things that other professions don't necessarily. And so they're taking a big risk by simply putting themselves into this situation where they're constantly performing and putting themselves in pressure. And this anxiety will become stronger as a result. But the process of going toward the value is less painful than avoiding it, is the ultimate argument. So
Daniel,
in the expert guitarist literature, there are some, are we running out of time?
I'm just giving you the 5 minutes, or maybe now we have about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Great. So literature on classical guitar performance necessarily provides a degree of insight from the heuristic knowledge that guitarists can offer. And F. Lee Ryan emphasized mindfulness techniques in yoga, which later were validated by Khalsa and Butler's studies on yoga and mindfulness, which you may have read. Azabagich emphasized non-eliminative approaches with converge with ACT. He talks about the idea that you can't that you experience when you perform, but you can rest anyway. You're used to those shakes that will happen, even though you're used to those experiences of arousal that you have. Great music. Tomás Villotó is another famous guitarist who teaches at the Peabody Conservatory, and he also describes breathing techniques that he uses that are taken directly from progressive relaxation, and he does not even realize it. His teacher to the next, and so he doesn't even cite those research when he talks about it in his pedagogy books. More importantly, classical guitarists have a unique disposition to MPA for a number of reasons. They have nail-related challenges. They have to file their nails in a specific way in order to make the sound. So if they walk into a wall or something, they can ruin a concert. So as you see, I have fake nails that I use to maintain that consistency, and I have to reapply them every week. There's also systems for holding the instrument, and there are many of them. So there are many guitarists that hold the guitar with a guitar lift, with a Murata support, it's called. And all of them are completely different. We don't have a consensus on what the best guitar support is in guitar pedagogy. We also give more solo performances than the other instruments. We don't accompany instruments. We don't accompany orchestral instruments. So we have a unique kind of isolation from the broader classical guitar community, classical music community. We have more solo performances, which exacerbate NPA. We have fewer performance opportunities as a result, and smaller dynamic range as an instrument. So guitarists end up having to push in order to get the sound, and they don't play as loud as a violinist. So playing in chamber music is always challenging. There's also a long legacy of problematic pedagogy coming from Andres, essentially the founder of classical guitar, has humiliating his students in master classes and having a very almost dictatorial approach to teaching, which has left a long legacy of trauma that has been passed on over the years. Segovia was basically a person who was unimpeachable in his time, so the impact he's made is quite large. And while they might not have expertise in psychology or NPA, classical guitarists can be seen as expert practicers. So the methodology, and I'm going to go straight to the conclusions, which is what everybody wants. And as expected, expert guitar instructors overwhelmingly recommended deliberate and efficient practice and frequent exposure, as you expect. Play as much as possible, practice as much as possible. That's going to solve it. And exposure and desensitization training are utilized, so these are all conforming with ACT. Most guitar instructors accepted that their symptoms could not be eliminated, while others acknowledged their symptoms as evidence of the love they have for music, as evidence of their values. In order to encourage flow through a healthy skill challenge balance, and this is probably one of the most core findings I saw consistently across all of the writers, I found that many guitar teachers mentioned the importance of choosing manageable repertoire, making sure the music was not too hard for the students so that they could feel confident and go into flow more easily. I did not expect behavioral psychology and music performance anxiety approaches from classical guitarists to be conforming with each other so much. I found very few disagreements in what I was writing, when I actually expected the opposite. For some guitarists, anxiety was seen as a manifestation of insecurity related to poor preparation or overly difficult repertoire, and none of the guitarists recommended pharmacological solutions such as beta blockers, which are very common in the competition scene, especially in classical music. Emphasizing physical fitness and meditation practices have promise, and the role of trauma needs to be analyzed more carefully, especially regarding abusive teachers and regarding past performance breakdowns. So I also found these areas for further research. And that concludes my presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Amazing.
Breathless?
Yeah, amazing, Daniel. That was so interesting. I found so much to relate to myself, actually, as both as a person who played the piano for 10 years as a kid, and now I can't even like come near a piano because I realize now I must have absolutely had musical performance anxiety and didn't even know that that was a thing. But also as a lecturer, and just to the performance anxiety that comes along with standing in front of a classroom and being a professor is something that I can really relate to from what you're saying. I thought the stuff you were saying at the end too about generational trauma was very interesting, and how that can be passed along through lineages of student-teacher relationships. And that too is something that we can see in academia, unfortunately. So yeah, super interesting.
Yes.
Do people have questions?
Yes, Francis, I have one question, and I actually started to put it in the chat. Daniel, thanks so much for your presentation. I thought it was fascinating in very much the same ways that Francis did. I've started to play the clarinet again just in the last 2 years, and there was lots for me to think about as I begin as a beginner again, rather than someone who has spent decades developing expertise in the academy. I haven't heard the term narratological before, and I understand what it is in the context of your work. You're using your own narrative as evidence and data to analyze. But can you tell us a little bit more about narratological perspective?
Yes, so it's exactly as you've described. Narratological perspective, by that I mean my own experience of music performance anxiety and describing my own life. So there is a section of the dissertation where I actually write about my origin and the different factors that played a role in music performance anxiety in my life.
So interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the process? Was that difficult for you to do? Did you find that?
Use music as a method to actually that affected the ways in which I approached music. So I used it as an escape, and I used it as a kind of I had a very one-track mind in the way I approached it. I thought this was my only way out of living in this environment, and so I put a lot of pressure on myself in order to make that happen. I also had it, and you're also talking about my parents and how they affected me as well, and then later my teachers when I went to the conservatory. How they affected my playing and actually influenced music performance anxiety. It also talks a little bit about my introduction to Buddhism and how I actually became introduced to meditation and the basically fundamental aspects of this research that later appeared. It also talks about a good friend of mine's suicide that happened later in the dissertation, which strongly influenced me to do this project. And that was because he was a very accomplished musician. He was a violist, and he went to Curtis Conservatory. He did all of the things you're supposed to do to become a great world-class musician, and it ended very darkly because he put so much pressure on himself, and he was not able to overcome his perfectionism. He was not able to do these things, and there are other factors involved as well. So all of these things play a role in my understanding of music performance anxiety, and as a teacher and pedagogue, it's important that I kind of lay that on the table and explain how that's actually affecting the strategies that I use to manage music performance anxiety and the others.
Daniel, you talked a little bit before about how it can be very painful to come face to face, with your experiences. Can you talk a little bit about your process about writing your own story? Did it come easily? Did you have to struggle a little bit?
It's always very painful. I thought that would be the easiest part of my dissertation because that's the part where you don't have any citations. But right. No, it is the hardest, actually. And I found it very cathartic in some ways because I myself that I never really realized until I had written them down. And I thought that was very powerful.
Thank you so much.
That's so interesting. I wouldn't have thought to say it, but once you say that, I can imagine it would be the hardest part to write about yourself. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Ellie has a question.
Yeah, wonderful presentation, and also, yeah, just seeing lots of kind of transferability to what students also share and what I experienced as a student in terms of like perfectionism and those different pieces of it. So I think also very transferable and very relatable also to a lot of the research I've done around like physicians and what happens in terms of, we don't use the word performance, but if you're thinking about being in the OR or those situations as a performance, you can see a lot of kind of correlation between what you're describing in terms of activated nervous systems and how are we taking care of that and how does that impact performance or doing the job that we've trained to do. So yeah, I just had a few questions, but one, I was just curious, you kind of mentioned in your presentation that you might see ACT as becoming the gold standard over CBT, and I was curious a little bit why you had that insight, and then also if you're looking at like MBCT at all, and if you would think that's comparable to ACT, or why for musicians you'd say like ACT over MBCT, and maybe I'll wrap something else into that because I could ask you lots, but just a small note also, I was curious, I know from its content that ACT has a lot of components that we might differentiate as mindfulness, but I believe ACT itself would not call them mindfulness or doesn't like formally like attribute those pieces to it. So I just curious about like differentiating that piece and then why ACT would be what you think is the gold standard, say for music performance, maybe over something like MBCT. So what you were kind of seeing from the different interventions that you were exploring, I was curious about. And within that, for physicians, like when we look at those different modalities, that there's often like in terms of transferability, that there's been adaptations made for different populations. So curious to see if you were seeing adaptations made for musicians across CBT, ACT, and the kind of MBIs, and then why ACT would be the one that you think becomes the gold standard over time.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that one of the core things that makes ACT so useful is the fact that it uses this hexaflex model. So there are many different aspects. And as you said, ACT uses many different interventions that they actually do describe as mindfulness practices, but they use a little bit more describe the type of mindfulness that they're using. So example that we have contact with the present moment is basically what we would normally associate with mindfulness, which is noticing where I am right now, noticing my heart rate, noticing my stomach, notice any tightness on my chest, for example. But there's also much deeper, and this really relates strongly to emptiness. There's much stronger forms of mindfulness called self as context. And self as context is really recognizing your existence as an interdependent being in the world. And to recognize that essentially you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, and the things that happen to you just because they appear are not necessarily true, but they are still valid. And so things like that are core to it. But ultimately, the reason why it's becoming much more, it will become the gold standard, I think, if it hasn't already. Diana Kenny described, Diana Kenny is the person who wrote the textbook on music performance anxiety. It's called The Psychology of Music Performance Anxiety. Described CBT as the gold standard at that time, but we hadn't had much research on ACT at that time. So David Junkos and his colleagues have been doing a lot of research on this since 2016. So the first big ACT study was done with a small sample size, just a single subject study design, which was followed by another single subject study design, which was followed by a larger subject design with 7 people and was increased to 16. And recently, Shaw and colleagues did a study on ACT that actually used it, and this is why I think it's very useful, used it actually to teach music teachers, to teach a vocal teacher after having a 7-hour ACT intervention training. Actually, this teacher was able to transmit ACT ideas to improve performance quality in her own students, and this is really something that's quite impressive. She was able to improve performance qualities to the level that was expected of an ACT practitioner in a previous study. So this is kind of impressive, the fact that it's so transmissible. It's something that you can actually share very easily to clients. It's something that they can understand very quickly, and it's something that really conforms with their experience. And you also don't have to wrestle with the client. So one thing that you notice with cognitive behavioral therapies, there is a little bit of wrestling with people's thoughts. You're trying to challenge their thoughts that are problematic. You're challenging them. And musicians tend to be to feel very strongly about their views. So I find that you don't have to wrestle with them with ACT. And there's a lot of other things like that. Appearing, what we really need to is a couple studies that really isolate it from CBT, but it has been compared to CBT for social anxiety disorder, and it had different results. It didn't reduce the symptoms as much, but it did increase people's cognitive flexibility, and their well-being scores were higher. So there is some really important stuff going on with ACT that is really, I think it's very promising. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Maybe not as
Great.
eloquently as I would have liked.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I feel like we could keep talking about your presentation for the whole time. There's so much to connect with for all of us, I think, from one angle or another. So I'm really excited about your work and glad that you're bringing this to the world of performance, musical performance, but also think that the kind of work you're doing will really have an impact on many other fields and areas of practice. So congratulations on this amazing achievement as you're making your way through your degree, and I look forward to seeing the published work when it's finished. I think we should, yeah,
Thank you
you.
for having me again. Great.
So I think we should now move to Tony. And I will briefly introduce Tony. Tony Scott has a Master's of Buddhist Studies from the University of Hong Kong. And then he came here to the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto to do his PhD work in Buddhist studies here. Tony has an interest in the intersection of Pali Buddhist commentarial texts, meditation theory, and Buddhist statecraft in South and Southeast Asia. His dissertation work is focused on a modern commentary that was published in 1948 by a scholar monk and also a pioneer of what's modern insight meditation. And this figure, who I think I hope we'll hear about today, was very controversial among monastic and government elites, with thousands of copies of his work confiscated by federal police even, and national legislation introduced in response to his work. So a very interesting character in the history of recent history of Buddhism. And I'm excited to hear more about Tony's work in this area now. Tony, if you'd like to get us started.
Yeah, sure. Can everyone see my screen and hear me? Okay. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's a real honor to be a part of this this talk today and this whole program. And I've said this before, but for me, it's really great to be a part of this with Daniel, because our work is so, I mean, it has overlaps, but it's so different. So it kind of makes me realize like how much there is actually out there in terms of the study of meditation and Buddhism and psychology, mental health. So, and I mean, I just love his attitude and just being able to kind of like, I've never met him, but I feel like we're friends. So this, you know, that's a really important thing for me in terms of this, this whole chance to be a senior doctoral fellow. So what I want to talk about today is Buddhist biopower and mass lay meditation in Myanmar. And this is both like kind of setting the scene for my dissertation. There's parts of my dissertation, and then there's some things that I hope to work on a little bit more once I finish my PhD and maybe have a little bit more freedom to kind of do some muckraking and different things like that around meditation. So just to begin, I want to ask you to kind of close your eyes and think of what is, you don't have to close your eyes, but what is the first image that comes to your mind when you think of meditation? And I would argue that for many of us, that would be this picture here of a Buddhist monk meditating alone. So it's a male monastic figure, isolated in the forest, kind of completely disconnected from the outside world. And that, if that's one of the images that comes to your mind, that's not a by mistake. There is historically contingent factors that bring that image to our mind. And I think that's both in terms of the way that we do Buddhist studies and how we look at texts about meditation. You know, we look at it in a very philosophical kind of abstract way. Usually it's male authors or male monastics are the focus. And we also see that on the flip side when you think of how meditation is marketed today. And so this is just like a really quick kind of discourse analysis, but if you think of the way meditation you see in what we call like neoliberal spirituality, and I'm taking that from Ron Purser, McMindfulness, and other scholars, you see that it's a very individualistic pursuit. For some reason, it's almost always white women, and of course that's perfectly fine. But it seems to be this is the group that's always used to market this. And I'm not calling it down and saying that this mindfulness kind of intervention doesn't have important applications. But what I want to say is that it's always considered to be individualistic. It's within a kind of a consumeristic mode, and it's for your own benefit. And the main thing is that it's depoliticized. So that's essentially what the idea I'm trying to disavow of through this presentation, my dissertation research in general. Because if we go to, let's say, the country now known as Myanmar or Burma in the 1950s, we actually see that meditation is a highly political act. And I would argue that it's always been a political act. Even though it can be done alone, it can be done in the forest by an individual person, you are engaging in a political act. The personal is the political, and I think that's especially true of meditation. And I think that's especially true of the history of meditation in Buddhist studies. I'm just going to talk about a particular case study. So I'm going to focus on this individual here, the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada, who died in 1955. And he is a pioneer of Vipassana or insight meditation, as Francis said. And sometimes I call him the pioneer, pioneer. Of course, the movement of insight or Vipassana meditation doesn't have just one cause or one condition that gave rise to it in the first half of the 20th century, beginning in the latter half of the 19th century. But this figure here is a very important and not really well understood or well-researched figure. And so my research is, in a sense, making an intervention and trying to bring this figure to the life. I realize I'm doing a little bit of great man of history theorizing here. And so I always try to get away with that, or sort of get away from that. And I sometimes fall back into the trap. So bear with me for that. But I do realize there are some problematics there. Now, what's interesting about this particular individual is that he was considered one of the living Arahants, or kind of enlightened beings of the 20th century. 250 years ago, if you would have stood up and said, hey, I've reached nirvana, the Buddhist path in, let's say, what we now call Myanmar, what we now call Thailand, there's a chance the king would disrobe you and make you shovel manure in the royal stables. But around the 1850s and later, we start to get the rise of individuals who were claiming certain kind of spiritual attainments, high spiritual attainments for themselves, getting wider currency for those claims, and not having the same pushback. And so this all has to do with like ideas of how long the Buddhist teachings are supposed to last and what is not possible. Again, a highly political discussion. I won't go too much into that, but this individual is one of the first people to kind of have this claimed for him, or claiming it himself. And I just show you the caption of this image very quickly. It says that this picture is him being an Arahant in flesh and blood. And I actually, I'm hoping to publish a paper on this whole idea of like images of Arahants or enlightened beings or what have you. But this is kind of important to set the stage, because as someone who's considered widely to be someone who's reached Buddhist enlightenment, a lot of social currency, a lot of cultural capital in that kind of claim. And so this is really quite a powerful figure as well. Now, just to take a step back and talk a little bit about, I'm just kind of having fun here with my slides. This here is in his one of his meditation centers, and this is a hallway where he would walk and a chair where he would sit. And his meditation method takes meditation and kind of demystifies it and presents it as practicing within one of the four postures. So walking in this case, so he'd walk along the hallway, sitting down, lying down, standing. And so the idea was that you were constantly kind of aware of your kind of embodied self, and you note this. So he has a simple noting technique where it's like noting that I'm standing, noting that I'm walking. That's why this whole kind of exercise is important here. And it was kind of widely ridiculed in the 1920s and 30s by people saying, oh, Buddhism is just like noting that you're sneezing, or coughing, or choking. There was a lot of derogatory remarks about his practice. But what he did was he simplified meditation practice and therefore opened it up to the masses, so to speak. And this here is a picture of the very first meditation center opened up in Myanmar, Burma for sure, maybe in Asia, maybe in the world. I mean, we could kind of quibble about that, and I don't have the ability to necessarily say that for sure, but 1911. And so the meditation center is an important institution in the rise of this modern Vipassana lay-oriented mass meditation movement that we're still kind of, a part of today. And I would argue in no sense that Buddhism, psychology, mental health is one modern manifestation of that movement that we see starting in Burma at around this time. And the reason it's important is because I'm sure there was always places in monasteries where monks could go and meditate. And there might have been also, homes or certain groups of people who had meditation place in their house, or especially among the elite. But here what we have is a center set up outside of the monastic grounds for both monks, nuns, and lay or unordained men and women to practice intensely, kind of supported by the community, not necessarily paying for it, but not necessarily having a vocation. And they would follow the same rules, more or less, or the same practices, whether they were monks or they were nuns. Now, of course, there's some gradations, and there's still a lot of kind of cultural rules to be followed around monastics. But this meditation center was a major innovation in Buddhist meditation in general. May have happened before, we don't have records, but this is definitely the first kind of iteration of it that we see in modern times. So what this did was this led to the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada, the monastic who I just showed you, having a series of very influential students, one of whom was the Mahasi Sayada. And the Mahasi Sayada is important, and here's just a video of him preaching, because he both spread this Buddhist meditation to Thailand, to Sri Lanka, to the West. He visited the Insight Meditation Center in Barre, Massachusetts, and kind of influenced like Goldstein and Salzburg and all this group of people, this kind of first wave, I guess you could say, of Insight meditators in America, North America. And he was very important for the Burmese government at the time. You could say he was kind of like not a client monastic, but he was certainly part of the state monastic hierarchy. And so what we see happening from this, just another picture. Oh, I just want to point out that as he was putting forth his training of Buddhist meditation, he was spreading it amongst the general population, especially women. This is an important kind of gender dynamic that I hope to discuss a little bit more in this presentation. That's an important part of my dissertation. And so women were preponderance of these lay meditators in a place like Burma. And I would actually argue around the world today, except for in India, my own personal anecdote, you see the mass meditation centers there, there's still a preponderance of men, but I would say everywhere else, you actually see that women kind of really make up the bulk of those people who are participating in this mass meditation movement. Now, why is this all important? Why is the Mahasi Sayadaw important? Well, because he was basically patronized by the first independent prime minister of Burma, U Nu. And so 1948, Burma gains its independence from Britain. And so U Nu was essentially inheriting like a devastated country. You had 60 plus years of British occupation, really transformed the whole society from top to bottom. So it was quite you could say a brutal social experiment in that sense. You had World War II, and so occupying foreign powers, having war back and forth in Burma, and Buddhism was seen to be under threat. So U Nu, along with his political program, early in 1949, put forward a Buddhist revivalist program. And as part of this Buddhist revivalist program, he used meditation, and particularly this mass meditation movement centered in meditation centers, to kind of restore the moral hygiene of the population and to rebuild the population, to bring about liberal ideas of prosperity and development that he was having. And so this was a very definite, you could say he was a very Buddhist prime minister in that sense. This was a very kind of premeditated use of meditation as a tool of statecraft and biopower, because it was about controlling the bodies, or somehow massaging or refining the bodies of the population in general. So what he did was in the late 1940s, early 1950s, he built kind of in a para-government organization, the Mahasasana Yekta, the Mahasi Meditation Center. So this is within the lineage of the Ming Goonjettavana. While the Ming Goonjettavana Sayadaw was alive, using his students' meditation technique. And the idea was that everybody throughout the Burma would send one person from their village to spend 10 days, 2 months, 3 months, a year at this meditation center, meditating like 20 hours a day, something crazy like that, and developing this technique in themselves, and then spreading it throughout their villages, throughout the country. And so this center is still extant in downtown Yangon today. And so I showed you the picture here with like the so-called high rise behind it. And this was a really important plank of U Nu's government policy in general. And you could argue that it's all coming from this one figure, the Ming Goonjettavana Sayadaw, who's at the kind of center of my dissertation. Now, here's a picture of the center today. And what's interesting about this picture is that you see people meditating together. So there's a monk at the front, but then you also have some nuns. Here's an example of a nun. Here's an example of a nun. And then there's some lay unordained women meditating, and they're all kind of meditating together, same technique, in the same space. And so this kind of, I don't want to necessarily use the word like democracy or the liberalization of meditation, but it's opening up meditation. And it's said that about 1 million people since the late 1940s have reached certain stages of enlightenment through the center since its inception. And so this is a kind of a socially accepted fact, a total social fact in Burma today. And then you see a proliferation of many other centers throughout the country. And this is just one example, but this is a government-sponsored meditation center. And when the Ne Win military coup happened in 1962, which is kind of the ramifications of which are still being experienced in Myanmar today, many of the UNU government officials basically took retreat at this Mahasasana Yigta center and lived out the rest of their lives meditating here. And it's even said that Ne Win, the military dictator, later in his life took up meditation at this site as well. So it just shows you that meditation is a very political and a very socially embedded act in a place like Burma, Myanmar. We don't necessarily see that today. This is a nice narrative, kind of a somewhat of a happy narrative that I'm giving you, but of course, as any good academic, I want to disrupt all of this. And so returning back to the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada, what's interesting is that while at the one time he was developing this meditation technique that was liberalizing Buddhist practice in general, he was also an accomplished scholar, and he wrote this text, a commentary on the Questions of King Milinda in 1948. And so a lot of my research is spent kind of looking at the intertextual commentarial techniques that we see in here, and I'm kind of knee deep in Buddhist literature. But what's interesting to note is that this is essentially meditation text, or you could say that it's premised by meditation. It discusses a lot about meditation. And in course of discussing meditation and putting forth the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada's theories around Vipassana meditation, he also makes the case quite explicitly for the full ordination of women in Burmese society. And so here's a picture of Tila Shins, which are known as like precept holders in Burma, praying before their meal. And so if you want to be a nun in Burma, technically you cannot become fully ordained and accrue all of the kind of social capital and be a part of the merit economy that you see with monastics in Burma. And what I mean is that these women are considered non-ordained renunciants. So they've left the household. They live kind of like a life in between homelessness and the domestic sphere. Unfortunately, most of them live in quite a bit of poverty. Many of them are children of are foster children or children who are orphaned for some reason or another. And so there's a really kind of a lower status for these female renunciants than there are for monks. And that's because the monastic hierarchy in Burma and the neoconservative kind of mindset of Theravada Buddhism does not allow these women to become fully ordained nuns. But the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada actually argued in his text, with meditation as a backdrop and as a technique and as a method, that these women should in fact be allowed to fully ordain. And I don't find any of this in his actual textual writing, but the reason he makes this case according to his lineage holders today is because there's kind of a rule in Theravada Buddhism that if a lay unordained person reaches enlightenment, they have to become ordained as a monk or a nun within 24 hours or they die. And we actually see this in the text, the Questions of Milinda, that the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada was commenting on. So this is kind of considered to be, orthodox belief in a place like Burma. And if there's actually a lot of cases, 60s, 70s, 80s, where men were meditating at the Mahasasana center, and all of a sudden they reach enlightenment, and it's like, holy cow, you better become 5-minute warning. Okay, thank you. It's the idea is like, oh, you better become ordained right away because you can't flout this rule. And that's all fine and good if you're a man and you have a pathway towards ordination. But if you're a woman and you don't have the pathway towards enlightenment or nirvana, that's very problematic, because then what are you supposed to do? Just die? Or you'll never be seen as actually reaching these higher stages. And there's a lot of cases in Burma today where men are considered to have reached the stage of Arahant or enlightenment, but there's very few, if not, I don't know of any, where women are said to have achieved the same status. They've achieved the penultimate status and below, but they haven't actually reached that full status. And if the claim of the Mahasasana Center is supposed to be believed that 1 million people have reached certain stages of enlightenment since the 1940s, then this creates a real problem. And so the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada in his text puts forward a pathway for how women should be reordained as nuns. And actually, part of my research is making the argument that this pathway is the basis for a lot of the bhikkhuni or nun ordination revival movement that we see in places like Sri Lanka, Thailand, not so much maybe Tibet, but in the Theravada world. So this is really important. But of course, it caused quite a bit of problems in Burma at the time. So here's just a slew of newspapers of people denouncing the Ming Goonjettavana for his call to reordain women. And this here is a newspaper that says how, 1,000 copies of his text were actually confiscated by the UNU government. And this is quite problematic because on one hand, the UNU government is patronizing the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada's meditation technique, with the other hand, he's confiscating the text of this person, and he's trying to, kind of censor essentially this movement towards nun ordination. And the reason why this is also problematic is because in 1954, the UNU government and Burmese Buddhism had the Great Buddhist Council, where they brought Buddhists from all over Southeast Asia, mostly a Burmese event, but nominally international. And they recited the Pali Canon and they sealed the Pali Canon. And so if you have a meditation master who's seen to be enlightened by general populace writing a text, trying to get that text into the canon, and at the same time you're sealing the canon, there's some conflict there. And in particular, the fact that it's not just anyone writing this text, but it's someone who's at the root of Vipassana meditation, this movement that's kind of sweeping the nation and changing power relations in Buddhism, it causes a lot of problems for the government. So what the government tried to do, and I'll wrap this up quickly, was pass a Buddhist courts act where instead of them making a decision on whether or not to confiscate this text, they wanted to get a group of monks together to decide whether this text was good or bad, to kind of pass off the blame or to pass the buck. Eventually, we see this in the 1980s, 1990s, and even till today. And actually, the first female Tilashin or female renunciant who ordained as a nun in Sri Lanka, came back to Burma, was prosecuted by a later version of this Monastic Courts Act. And so it's all kind of connected here. Now, the Ming Goonjettavana Sayada, his text, while it was confiscated, was actually etched onto stone, and you see it here today behind bars because it's still a highly controversial subject. But this idea of etching it on stone in order to, on these marble stelae, in order to make it last for future generations, shows you just how controversial the text still is. So, I mean, there's some actual particular conclusions that I have around my dissertation, but just a little bit to show you what I'm reaching towards. What I'm trying to say, use this as a case study, is that we really need to rethink how meditation is understood in our society. Here's a picture, albeit a little bit blurry, of people meditating in a meditation center out in Barrie, Ontario, as part of the SN Goenka tradition. And you see people of all different walks of life going there for 10 days, meditating quite intensively. And what I'm trying to say is that when they do this, and I always wondered, like, why would people who have different backgrounds, different religious views, different political views come to this center? And what I'm trying to say is that it's their own kind of political act in a society, even if they're not necessarily wittingly aware that this is a political act. I do want to try to impress upon the idea that this mass meditation movement has political consequences. And just kind of finish this off, one example, what we see is the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and this is a little bit beyond my dissertation, where they had a meditation blockade. So meditating plus blockade. And in 2014, they were blockading the militarization of police. I think this was somewhere in Southern California. And so I guess the last thing I just want to say is that we understand Buddhist meditation as a depoliticalized phenomenon for very, very kind of pervasive, historically contingent reasons. But if we actually look at Buddhist history and certain case studies, I think that should cause us to reappraise the role of meditation within our society in general. Thank you so much.
Well, that was amazing, Tony. Thank you. I have seen you give a talk on your research before, but it's been a number of years. And so this is a kind of a new expansion of what I'd heard before. And so important. What your message is here is like so fascinating and really important and very well organized and presented. So thank you so much. As usual, you're a very clear speaker, so I really appreciate that. I do have some questions, but maybe we can start with other questions if others want to get us going. Maybe we can let Daniel go first, if you don't mind, Ellie, as our other fellow. Daniel, did you want to? Oh, there you are.
Oh, sorry, you glitched out. I thought you were saying for Ellie to go first. Sorry.
No, I was thinking if you'd like to go first.
Yes. Oh, yes. Of course. Yeah, Anthony. That was an amazing presentation. I wanted to say. There's one moment where you described Theravada as being neoconservative, which I thought was a real mind-blowing statement. So could you clarify what you meant by that? And with that, could you also explain, is there a link there between neoconservatism kind of co-opting Buddhism into mindfulness and bringing it into the corporate world to make people more docile, and bringing it into the military to make snipers more effective, and things like this? Are these things that, are these related? Yeah, I'm just very interested.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you asked like the hardest question probably. And I do see my dissertation research as one of the larger contributions is poking a hole in this idea of the neoconservative self-projection of Theravada Buddhism, especially in a country like Burma. And what's interesting is that, so I'll say a few things. If you were to go back to what we now call Burma 300-400 years ago, you would get a very hairy kind of Buddhism, if I may say so. You know, you'd have probably monks like wearing hats, and you'd have monks who were like probably like, you know, saying they could cure your whatever disease, or monks or nuns or different forms of renunciants who were probably part of like even the military or part of warfare and different things like that. And you probably had like Mahayana beliefs. I mean, Burma is close to Bengal and areas like Tantric Buddhism. And so what we understand by all of that, and what happens, and happens in Buddhist history quite a bit, and I don't want to say it's cyclical, but it goes through phases where you'll get a strong leader who comes in and says, we're gonna push down all of this what we don't understand is pure Buddhism, and we're going to reinforce, or we're going to enforce, I think is the right word, a certain standard that we understand, and that's a textual standard. And so this is why this whole idea of the Sixth Buddhist Council in 1954 and the sealing of the text is important, because if you have a whole bunch of weird text flying around and you say like, hey, my behavior seems odd, but I'm just following this text, then the authorities have to get rid of that text. They have to suppress that text in some way. And so the idea that when we have neoconservative, we have Theravada presented as this pure form of Buddhism, this textual form of Buddhism, is because anything that falls outside of what is defined as a canon can be dangerous in terms of what it allows monks and others to get away with. And so this all ties into what we see happening in colonial modernity, and the idea that Buddhism is textual, or real Buddhism is found in the text. And what you see people in Tibet or people in China practicing is a kind of, degradation, or people in Sri Lanka 200, 150 years ago is the degradation, de-evolution of Buddhism. And that we as scholars, especially white male embodied scholars, can have access to this text and have a virtuoso around language. And so in so doing, you make real Buddhism something to be somewhat timeless, and all the types of Buddhism you see practiced as being really kind of like bastardized forms of Buddhism, if I may say. And so there's this connection between what's happening in Burma and kind of control over the bodies of monks, because a lot of this has to do with what's allowed in terms of Vinaya regulations or monastic discipline. And then that kind of dovetails with what we see happening in colonial modernity and textual scholarship and all those kind of things. So those are I mean, there's so many different webs to untie, or loose ends to kind of tie up there. So I can't really answer your question. But what I will say is that there is this certain, now I want to push back against this a little bit, because we don't really know about the early history of Vipassana meditation. And I do think Vipassana meditation was also quite an embodied practice, but there's a certain sense that Vipassana meditation is all about the mind and is all about like rational ways of understanding your psychology and reaching enlightenment through this cerebral kind of gestalt switch, whereas other forms of meditation like tantric meditation or older forms that we see in Southeast Asia were using like Ayurveda and like embryology and sacred grammar and all these weird, like alchemical processes, all these weird things. So Vipassana meditation, partly through its own internal forces, partly through the colonial interaction, presents itself as being the more rational type of Buddhist meditation. And so it's very easy to then pick that up and as a, American coming back and trying to present it to someone in North America or in Europe and downplay all of these so-called superstitious aspects of Buddhism, or you could say maybe more even moral aspects of Buddhism, and present it as a science of the mind. And so when it's presented in this certain way, I do think that makes it more amenable to being used by military or makes docile subjects and what have you. But what I would want to say is that this whole neoliberal spirituality and the so-called kind of appropriation, that has probably been going on in Buddhist Asia for a very long time as well. It's just we have a certain sense of blinders because of the way we fetishize Buddhism and the way we imagine meditation as a projection of our own self. So a little bit of a ranting answer there, but I really appreciate you asking that.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm kind of wishing, Tony just finished teaching the class JNR 301 for BPMH and religion on the history of meditation, and I wish I had attended that class. Ellie, you had a question?
Yes, and thank you for a great presentation, and always fascinating also to kind of get to, I always want to take everyone's classes because I have just such a different lens coming from background of like neuroscience and like Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged mindfulness. So it's so fascinating again to hear like all the different, we'd say like, in I think many of our courses we teach like Buddhism has a rich and complex history. And so there's so much there. So I could talk for years to you, so I will try and just ask one question instead. But yeah, I get maybe two things. At one point that I was just thinking, I don't know if this shows up in your dissertation or some context that I'm really interested in bringing in. Particularly, I had some guests like from India come to do some guest lectures for me over the last few years, and just Jan Willis also was just here with the Ho Center, and really making a point that when we have these kind of conversations in our modern context, just to really consider also bringing in the point that, if we look at the Buddha as like a historical figure at the time, that the case there being made for women, for untouchables to be fully ordained. And so just something interesting maybe to bring into the discussion to kind of situate it, that I was wondering if it was in there or if it's missing, is just, where do we find ourselves at the time point that you're studying, but then also just to relate back to kind of these roots of knowing that it was proposed, by the Buddha that women and untouchables should be included, and then how that maybe has changed contextually was something I'm curious if you've looked at that or brought that in a little bit. And then maybe my other question, I'll pose kind of two in one so I can hand the mic back to you. I am just curious a little bit maybe about your definitions around enlightenment and things being political, because what interests me from my understanding of the text would be, say, like, in the time of the Buddha or these historical spaces, and from Thich Nhat Hanh's reading of it, which is what I'm most familiar with, would be a real assertion that these practices are about our own minds, about our own inner compassion, about bringing that into the world. And so there is centrally a component that is not political. However, it may have a political influence. So I'm just curious, because I totally also hear what you're saying, which is like in the cultural context and right now, it's having a huge influence on politics, that it's being utilized by politicians. And so my question is how you define something being political in your thesis. And is it that if a movement impacts politics or is used by politicians, it is therefore political? Or is it that you see within the text a intention for this to be utilized in a political way. So I'm just so curious about how you're looking at that and that kind of complex intersection of like, we as humans are messy, but then we have these ideas, you know, for training our minds being something that I think we're always exploring in so many of my courses. So anything you want to say, and just fascinating to hear what you're up to.
Thank you. And those are wonderful questions and really difficult for me. Like, I'm kind of like, oh no, how am I going to kind of untangle all of this? And that's great. You know, I really appreciate that opportunity to go with the first question first. I'm just right now writing a paper for like a kind of a gender asymmetry conference in Buddhism, where I'm trying to unpack all of these ideas around the arguments made for the full ordination of women. And a lot of it has to do, as you say, with interpreting the scripture and trying to understand what the Buddha's pronouncements on how long the Buddhist teachings or the sasana will last. And so one thing that I would say is that a lot of it has to do with the longevity of the Buddhist teachings, because there's this kind of famous pronouncement by the Buddha that, okay, I'll allow women to be ordained, but in so doing, I will actually reduce the lifespan of the Buddhist teachings from 1,000 to 500 years. And commentaries play a really important role here, because then the commentaries say, well, yes, the Buddha did say that, but because the Buddha put on these extra rules to women called the Garudhammas, or like the heavy rules, then that actually means that that Buddhism will last for a full 5,000 years. And so there's this idea that Buddhism will last for 5,000 years, even with women having been ordained, but what is and what is not possible within that whole 5,000 years. And that is something that I think becomes political, in the sense that it allows certain, and this is unfortunate, again, this falls into the trap of the great man theory of history, because it allows certain figures to get away with certain things or prohibit certain things, depending on what stage we are in the Buddhist sasana or the Buddhist teaching. And this seems like kind of an abstract, question, but for Buddhists throughout, for Buddhists in Asia, if I can speak very monolithically, this is a really important kind of fertile ground for potential action. And so, for instance, there was a period of time about 400 years ago in Burma, what we now call Burma, where it was thought that we had reached such a stage of decay in Buddhism that not even monks were possible. And so what the Buddhist king at the time did was suppress this group of people, totally wipe out this group of people who believed that there shouldn't even be such a thing as monks, and declare himself as the future Buddha coming in the next Buddha age. And that caused a lot of uproar, allowed him to do certain things and change Buddhism in general. But what you see happening with Vipassana, and this is where, the Maitreya cults, absolutely, Daniel. So this has a lot to do with that. What we see happening at this time in Burma is that it was said that around 205,000 years during the age of the Buddhist sasana or teachings, there was like a new window that opened up for like maybe 100 years or 500 years, where Vipassana allowed people to once again become enlightened. And so the whole argument becomes, okay, so if this can happen, if men can become enlightened, can't the same be true? Same be said for women? And there's textual precedents where, yes, women are just as easily enlightened as men, but there's also texts that are saying, it's not possible to reinstate the female order of nuns. So, I mean, I'm kind of ranting here or rambling a little bit, because your question is very difficult to answer, but essentially what we see is contradictions within Buddhism itself. And these contradictions are trying to be smoothed out by different, interpretive regimes. And a lot of that has to do with who has the power to enforce their interpretations. Because I think you can make a case, as the Ming Goonjettavana does scripturally, that nuns should be reordained. And he's basing this discussion in Pali texts that are said to date to the time of the Buddha or soon thereafter. Whereas the monks who are against this are making the same case in essentially the same texts. But who has the ability to enforce this and to get the authorities on their side? That's where things become political. Now, to go to so I didn't adequately really answer your question. I'm still trying to work through some of these things on my own. To go to your second question, this idea of central, one thing I would say, and this, I really learned this as I was studying different types of Buddhism. I mean, what is meditation? partly. So I never even really thought to discuss what, to define what politics is. And I think that's partly because as a religious studies major, someone in Buddhist studies, I'm kind of like, airdropping political science or politics into my field. And I haven't maybe approached it as critically as I should. But what I would say is part of meditation is not just to change your mind, but also to kind of change your reality, to change the world. Right. And we see this in certain types of like Tibetan meditation, visualizations. I think we also see this in like Pure Land Buddhism. And so this idea of trying to, and I mean, Pure Land Buddhism, really interesting kind of political connotations. And this is your point. Is it political connotations or is it actually a political act? And so what I would say is this kind of reimagining of your world and trying to visualize a different reality around you. I do think that in a way is inherently political because you're trying to change the conditions, the social, political conditions of your actual existence. And then what I would also say, though, is that, I mean, in a way, the Buddhist community at the very beginning was always very political. And that's not just because of its conditions and what gave rise to it, what's happening in, the Gangetic plains and everything at that time, but just creating an actual monastic community or some community that's set outside of mundane reality and trying to create these rules and trying to, make this last and the conditions that lead to enlightenment. I do think that has always been a little bit political. And I guess what I would just end by saying, again, inadequately answering your question, you've given me a lot to think of, is that there's enlightenment is one thing, and how we can define that. I think that's kind of like, the real question of a lot of this. Enlightenment is socially constructed, ultimately, what it is as a category, at least how we define it or talk about it. And the conditions that one leads, the conditions that lead one to enlightenment are conditions that are shared with all different communities. So the last thing I'll say is there's a certain, there was a movement in the 1930s and 40s in Burma that said, we cannot follow the 5 precepts with an empty stomach. And so the idea is like, hey, we want to be good Buddhists, but we're starving over here. And so we can't possibly refrain from stealing and all those different things. So you've given me a lot to think of. I mean, I'd be curious to see what you think about that, because my intention is not to put down some of these more therapeutic applications of Buddhism, because I think they are important and people need them. But I think it's also to just show that there's a possible, third way, or there's alternatives out there and how we actually axiomatically understand and approach Buddhism.
Yeah, wonderful. So skillfully said. We're wrapping up on the end of our time here. Did you want to say something in response, Ellie, or?
I'll drop a few things into the chat, but just fascinating to have these conversations. I think they are the debates happening. I had a few monastics from the Plum Village tradition in my class this year trying to define, some of these questions. What is enlightenment? How are we getting at that? What makes it pragmatic and useful? What makes it, socially and contextually taken up by culture? So a wonderful conversation, and really happy to connect some time. And if I have your email, or maybe we can drop it in the chat, I have some recordings of the monastics in my class actually this year talking to some of this. So I'd be really happy to share them with you, and great to hear your perspective from the text that you've been exploring. So learning lots, great to be here.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to conclude this session. That was really amazing. 2 outstanding presentations from 2 outstanding scholars. And I'm so happy to have had you both in the program this year, and super excited to see how your careers progress and how your work continues, and to hear more from you as time goes on with these really important and I think very influential projects that you're both working on, both of which speak really to contemporary issues as we've been discussing.
Thank you so much, Francis, and thank you, Tony and Daniel. What a great session, and what a wonderful opportunity for someone who isn't teaching within the program to have a bird's eye view to some of the big issues that you're talking about. And as Francis said, how you're applying all kinds of things to a current moment. Really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay.
And we wish you all the best as you move closer and closer towards defense.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. Good luck, Daniel.
Thank you, Anthony. That was amazing. Thank you.
You
Incredible.
too.
Really, really.
Hopefully we get to meet in person.
Yes, definitely. Love to go for coffee with you sometime.
That'd be awesome.
That'd be great. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.